What you're looking at here is not retail World of Warcraft. So what is it? So it turns out that it's about 8 million lines of C++, plus some little bits of other things mixed in there as well. A boatload of SQL, thousands, not tens of thousands of SQL records in a MySQL database. It's a Linux server, and it's the WoW client at the other end, which is what you're visually seeing on the screen. However, what is it? Still the question is, what is it? Well, it's AzerothCore. As I said in the introduction to this project, I'm going to be introducing AzerothCore in order to emulate World of Warcraft so that we can look at it as a software project that we have to deploy using DevOps practices. And we'll even take it further as well, and we'll actually manipulate the world so that you can actually see changes being made to the database, and then we'll look at doing continuous integration and continuous delivery for those changes. But before we actually get started and go into any more of those details, yes, I started recording on a different day with a different shirt on this time, but we have some questions that we need to actually ask. So first of all, what is AzerothCore and how is it constructed? What are the components that it's made up of? What does its architecture look like? And what does it let us do as a piece of software? These are important questions for a DevOps engineer because you need to know what software is doing. You need to know how it's architected so that you can actually provide the infrastructure for it. And you need to look at all of the components and all of its dependencies. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this video with regards to AzerothCore. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to look at are those components that actually make up AzerothCore. Now, there is the client side of things, which we're not interested in. We're going to be looking at the server side of things because that's where we have an open source project that we have control over. And that's the thing that we're going to be deploying. So throughout this project, we're not going to be dealing with the client side of things at all. We just want to emulate the back end of World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King version 3.3.5a, which is what AzerothCore gives us. So briefly, let's just look at the client. The client is made up of lots of things, primarily 3D models, graphics, sounds, and obviously the thing that you interact with as a player. These are important files that come out of the client, and as you can see by this line here, they are extracted and they are put server-side along with the world server. But before we get into that, we'll briefly just cover the auth server. So what does the auth server do? The auth server quite simply authenticates you as a user and then provides you with a list of world servers. The auth server is really simple. Well, simple in that it's nowhere near as complicated as the world server, so we're not really interested in it all that much, but we will talk about it over time. The big thing that we're interested in is this world server right here. The world server itself is made up of several components. It's got its configuration file. It's got the configuration files for individual modules as well. We'll be looking at those in the future. It's got SQL files, which populate the world with creatures and items and quests and area triggers and mailbox items and all kinds of things. The instances, dungeons, defines the monsters themselves, their templates, what they look like. There's a lot of SQL that goes into this thing, and we're going to be manipulating a lot of SQL in the future as well. And then we've got those files that are contributed or brought over from the client itself. These files are actually, my understanding is that they're extracted and new files are made from the original client side files. I don't really understand what these files do. All I know is that they have to be there. And the DBC files are database, they're client database files, so they tell the client information about the world at the client side. The world server needs that information as well. The M maps, the maps, and the V maps, my understanding is that these are all about the physical world itself. These are things like the 3D meshes and all of the collision meshes that allow you to walk through a wall or not walk through a wall, and where you can and can't go. So we're going to be looking at that in more detail in the future. And then we've got, of course, MySQL, and that stores obviously all of those SQL files that the world server provides. They're injected into the MySQL database. And so that is the components in a nutshell. It's actually not that complex from a DevOps perspective. There are only three components here that we care about. We don't really care about the rest of them, especially the WoW client. Okay, now let's look at the architecture. So how is this architected? How is everything put together? What are the components? How do they actually talk to each other? And this is a very simple overview, and then we'll actually look at things in a little bit more detail. So here we can see that we have step one. We have our client here. which obviously resides somewhere on the public internet, basically anywhere in the world, right? And the client is going to talk TCP, transport control protocol. It's going to talk. That's what's going to talk to each of the servers, the auth server and the world server. Now, when you authenticate with the server and you log in, this is step 1. You talk directly to the auth server on port 3724 via TCP. This is just an internal IP address. This is an internal IP address. If you're going over the internet, that would be a public. That would be a public IP address, of course, and of course that would also be a different, or even the same, could be the same public IP address. Then once you've completed the connection and you've sent your details over, the auth server then talks to the MySQL server, and it basically says, can this customer actually log in? Is this account valid? What gets then returned to the client is the world server information and the list of world servers, or again, as they're called in World of Warcraft, realms. Then once it's got that list, one of the things that's inside the realm is information about the IP address and the port that the client needs to connect to in order to talk to that world server, log in as the client, as the character, I should say, and then actually move around inside the world. That's step 4. And that's a very brief, simple architecture overview of the actual architecture itself. Step 1, our client authenticates with the auth server. The auth server checks against the database, the details in the database. It then returns a list of realms. One of them is, as we see here in this little basic diagram, on IP 3456, public IP 3456. It's obviously just a fictitious IP I've just made up, and it connects to port TCP 8085, and that's the world server. And then the world server then acts as obviously a remote version of the game that the client then talks to, and the client says, I'm doing this, and the world server then confirms whether that's valid or not, and also transmits it to other clients as well. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated, this, and we can get a bit more complicated in this when we look at quite a detailed authentication workflow. Now, by the way, I'm going to leave a link in the description to this whole diagram. This is a mirror board. And essentially, it's an open source mirror board, if you like. I've left it open. It's shareable. It's observable. You can come in and have a look. You can't edit it, but you can come in and add a look. And I'm going to be documenting the diagrams here, the workflows, etc. And this will allow us together to better understand how all of this works. So this is the auth flow in much more detail. So I won't go into it. I won't spend the next 10 minutes go over this. We'll look at it sort of a bit just as quickly as we did the last one. Step 1, our remote WoW client on 12, 13, 14, 15 IP address connects over the public internet, and it connects to port 3724 TCP 3724, and it hits some sort of network router. Now this is based on you having the WoW server-side emulation running on inside of your private network at your home. So you're going to hit your network router. That's the thing provided to you by your ISP. Step 3 is you're going to probably do some sort of NAT forwarding, so network address translation, or some sort of port forwarding, and you're going to forward TCP 3724 as part of step 3. You're going to forward that to the auth server on the internal IP address, which is 192.168.1.6. Again, don't worry about the IP addresses. Specifically, it doesn't actually really matter. This is just for illustration and education purposes. The authentication server then, as part of step 4, is going to do that MySQL interaction again. And what that looks like is it's going to come to this table here. It has more columns than this, but the table contains all the information with regards to the realm list. This is what the table is called. And it contains information like the IP address of the realm, the name of the realm. But it also contains information like the local IP address of the realm on the internal network and the subnet mask to look out for. All that's really saying is if the client is connecting from an IP address inside this subnet mask, give them the local address. Otherwise, give them the public address. And if we look, that is the public address of 55667788. That's the public address of our network router, because we're running the world server on our private network. So then that's step 4. We can see here as well that the auth server will actually, if you give it an IP address of the realm server itself, it will actually, if you give it a host name like this, wow.domain.tld, what it'll actually do is the auth server will do a DNS resolution of that, and it'll take this IP address and it'll return it to the client. It won't return the domain name and let the client resolve it, it will resolve it for the client. So then what happens is step 5 is we can see this line here coming out, going over to the public internet, and that's what's going back to the WoW client. Now that connection would obviously, go back through the network router itself, obviously, but it's basically returning the IP address to the WoW client. The client then, part of step 6 here, we can see this different colored cable here, reconnects back to the network on 8080, TCP 8085, and then that is then forwarded to the internal WoW server, which also in turn talks to a MySQL server. Over on the right here, we can see that if we have a local WoW client on the internal network, an IP address that matches this subnet here, there's no natting or anything because it's on the local network, so it gets given the local address, and then the client then makes a connection to the world server on that internal address. And so that's essentially the authentication workflow along with the overarching architecture. And that's all we really need to know as DevOps engineers. We only really need to know the port numbers, IP addresses, what talks to what. How does it talk to that thing? What port does it talk to that thing on? Does it need to be in a completely separate network? And so on and so forth. And so as engineers, we need to know this information about how it behaves so that we can set up the infrastructure so it can behave in that way, and that there are no surprises for the software, which, from my experience, will probably just fall over if the infrastructure isn't perfectly set up. So now that we actually know what it looks like from an architectural perspective and each component and how they plug together, let's now look at this. Let's look at this from an in-game perspective, and let's actually go and look at an object in-game, and then let's actually find that object in the database. Sound good? Let's have a look. So here we are inside of a World of Warcraft being emulated locally on my computer. As you can see, it's World of Warcraft. I can move around in it just as you normally would. But I'm actually a game master, so as you can see, I can jump up and down just like a normal character. Everything appears normal, except I can actually fly and do various other things that you wouldn't normally be able to do in the game. But let's turn that off and let's actually have a look at something. So this character here, okay, I'm gonna get some information on this NPC, and then I'm gonna go and look them up inside the database. So there's a GM command that allows me to do NPC space info, and it's just down here at the bottom. It's a little hard to see because of the resolution, but I'll zoom in on it. But effectively, I can get information about this NPC, and its current identity within the database is actually 240. That is the actual NPC ID. So let's now go and have a look at that inside the database. Okay, so as you can see, we are inside of the database server now. So I've used the MySQL command line tools to just connect to the database engine. It says MariaDB, that's just the engine that I selected, but I recommend that you just use MySQL. It does the job just fine. I've connected to the AzerothCore_world database. Now that is the world database for AzerothCore. There's also the Authentication database, which handles that authentication process, and there's also the characters database, which is for all of your characters that you have on your account. So when you log in, you get your character screen, and you select your character, that's that database. And then the world is for the NPC that we just looked at, which is the Marshal. So if we look at this database just on its own to give you an idea what future videos are going to be about, for example, it's 288 rows. That means there are 288 tables just in this database. There's a lot involved with representing an MMO in a database, so there's a lot to learn. If we have a look specifically at the creature_template table, this is 65 columns wide. Okay, this is 65 columns wide to represent a creature in the world. There are 65 columns containing all kinds of information, and this is only a small fraction of it. There's also information about the items that they have on them, the loot that they drop, and various other things. And we're going to look at that in future videos as well. But let's see if we can find our guy from before. So we're going to do select entry and name. I know that these columns quite well because I've been manipulating the data and the database quite a lot. From creature template, where the entry equals 240. So I know that the entry is 240 because we looked at it before with the GM command, didn't we? We looked at it before and we got it. So if I press enter on that, you'll see that entry 240 is the Marshal himself. I think that says Marshal Dughan, whatever. That's the Marshal. There he is in the database. That's what he's represented by. Now let's do something. Let's actually rename the Marshal. Let's just do that briefly. So if we go update creature_template, I'm actually tabbing there as well to complete the table name. update creature template. We're going to do set name equals. I'm going to call him Marshall Crilly. Got to name him after myself. Why not, eh? I'm going to say where entry equals 240, and we can see that one row was affected by that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart the server, and then I'm going to go back into the world, and then we're going to see that change in the real world. Well, the virtual world. And here he is. It's Marshall Crilly. Right there, in the flesh, in the pixels I should say. Right, okay, well as you can see there's a database change. There it is. And there's Marshall Crilly. I'm probably going to put that back just to be on the safe side, because obviously if you ever make a change like that and then you release those changes to people, which I will be doing, all the changes I'm going to be making I'm actually going to release via an open source project called World of Warcraft, and we'll go into that project in the next video so you can understand why I'm actually doing all of this. But if you release those changes and then someone goes and reads a guide and it's like, go and speak to Marshall Dungan, they're going to be who this Marshall Crilly guy. So there you go. That's a change being made in the database, and then it's being directly reflected in the game itself. So what have we learned today? Well, we've seen AzerothCore in action. We've looked at the results of the world database, the auth database, the character database. We've looked at in-game objects. We've found them in the database. We've manipulated them. And then we've looked at the architecture of what makes all of that actually possible. So in the next video, I'm going to introduce the World of Warcraft. I'm going to start looking at how we can now start manipulating this game. And then when we go on this journey, we'll start actually implementing DevOps tools around World of Warcraft, around the open source project. And you can chip in as well if you want to. I'll share the link in the description below, and together we can actually set up a completely different world if we want to, or we can just add to it in tiny bits and move little things around. But what we're actually really interested in, I should say, is the DevOps side of it. How do we deploy this software? How do we automate it? How do we take our changes, put them through pipelines, and so on and so forth? So hopefully this has been fun. I can't wait to get around to the next videos. It's been really fun to make. It's a really cool project. I hope you agree. I hope that was interesting, and Daisy and I will see you in the next video. I'm actually going to take her for a little walkie now because she's earned it, because she's a good girl. She's a very good girl.